Slavery as an institution is one of the few things that can be described as present throughout pretty much all of human history, everywhere. We have evidence of slavery predating written records, and for context of how absurd that statement is, carving a line for each slave you own into a rock is more conceptually advanced technologically than owning the slaves themselves. We used to believe that we needed agriculture and that whole Neolithic revolution to produce the surplus of food necessary to maintain slavery, until we realized that no, we actually still have slavery in hunter-gatherer societies. And it's not like this institution is over in the modern day either. Basically, think of a period in history, slaves were around. The extent, capacity, economic reliance, and everything else regarding the institution varied, of course, but this disclaimer at the start exists because 40% of my viewers are Americans, meaning it is a reasonable guess that 20% of my viewers are under the impression that slavery was invented in 1776 and ended in 1863. This does mean that if you happen to be a company called Paradox Interactive making games set in history where all the slavery stuff happened and is still happening, well, it's hard to win. In many cases, plugging your ears in and just ignoring slavery really hard doesn't work, as it means you fail to modern reality. And while I believe it is not considered a controversial political statement to say that slavery is bad, we have to model it with the assumption that a non-trivial part of the player base is a bunch of tryhards that have no issue breaking the Geneva Convention for a 5% increase in tax revenue. And this is already coming on top of the straight-up war crimes committed by the regular for even the casual players. Before you complain and claim to be different yourself, when was the last time in Stellaris that you had a fair election? When you play Hearts of Iron 4, do you try and stay in civilian economy as long as possible so that your people may have a good life? In fact, when was the last time you negotiated with rebels in EU4 instead of just sending the army in to slaughter them? In essence, Paradox has the wonderful problem that if they do tackle the concept of slavery, tryhard players will institute 25-hour work shifts to maximize production. That player is me, I am the problem. Speaking of me, before we get into the rest of the video, where we'll be taking a look at how Paradox end up dealing with the issues for the games it covered, let's get some of the usual stuff out of the way. A like on it would be appreciated if you haven't already, and a subscription would be amazing. We're almost at 32k subs now. Getting that half stack of subs would be incredible. So feel free to help me out and let me get to that goal. Anyway, enough self-shitting.
Today's subject
is slavery. And we begin actually with Imperator Rome. Just because Paradox Interactive forgot about this game doesn't mean I did. Now, I wanted to claim that Imperator Rome is the oldest Paradox game in terms of time period, but actually that title goes to millennia. Okay, you know what? I'm going to ignore that one. Imperator Rome is the oldest Paradox game by historical time period covered. And if you want to comment that the statement is wrong, go right ahead. Go into the comments and talk about millennia. Lord knows the game needs the publicity. Anyway, when it comes to slavery in Imperator Rome, honestly, they did what can best be described as a job with it. The system is functional but bare bones, and frankly, that is a good summary of the game as a whole. Imperator Rome has a genuinely excellent foundation, including for systems like slaves and the institution of slavery, but they didn't build on it in any meaningful way that is worth commenting. Slavery in Imperator Rome is there. It is represented through the pop system that is finally devolved from the development system that Paradox Interactive loves to use, as the company finally started to realize that development, meaning how advanced the population is, has the unfortunate side effect of a British person with an iPhone contributing more to development score than 100,000 Chinese agricultural laborers. With that said, slavery certainly existed and was widespread during the time period of the game, but in honest reality it's hard to comment on a system as it is very clearly unfinished, and we can only at best speculate that the system would be like had the game continued development. I commend Paradox for not shying away from the topic though. And with that said, we move on to Crusader Kings, namely both Crusader Kings 2 and 3. Earlier in the introductions, I mentioned that one of the possible methods of addressing the question of slavery throughout history was to ignore it really hard, and frankly that's kind of what Crusader Kings as a whole does. The main game is built around feudal relationships, and I guess this is a good time as any to mention that I personally do not consider the average feudal peasant to be a slave, mainly because the people at the time also didn't, many places having acknowledged the differences between an enslaved individual and a freeman peasant. With that said, it would be ignorant to not acknowledge the fact that slavery declined, for lack of a better word, between the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, and would only pick up when the Portuguese realized they didn't like harvesting sugarcane actually. However, the whole Islamic slave trade kinda happened in this period as well, and it's practically ignored. And while Europe had less slavery than the Arab world, at this point it wasn't due to a lack of effort. Gaelic Ireland was raiding Britain for slaves before the Romans even left, and you know when Rome dipped, they definitely capitalized on that opportunity. How do you think St. Patrick got into Ireland? Oh right, he was kidnapped into slavery by the Irish. I'm also sure you've heard of Dublin before too, and while it would be inaccurate to say that it was founded to be a slave port in the modern understanding of the term slave port, ignoring the large Dublin slave markets would also be an act of willful historical ignorance at best, and downright historical revision is at worst. Irish slaves would end up everywhere between Iceland and Iberia, where in Iceland they would actually end up being 40% of the founding population, and indeed in 875 the slaves would lead a slave revolt that would be the largest slave rebellion since the end of the Roman Empire. Basically, yeah, Crusader Kings, whether we're talking 2 or 3, had slavery during this time period, and while ignoring it, it doesn't hinder the main game loop of have dynasty go on crusade and build medieval empire. Its general ignorance does hinder, and I use this term cautiously, historically accurate gameplay. It does however mean that the second part of the CK2 and CK3 section sections, namely how is slavery seen from a try-hard player point of view, is irrelevant here. Slavery doesn't impact the game because it doesn't exist really, so it has no real game impact. At best, one could argue the CK3 concubinage system, where you can capture a person and put them in your prison cells, after which you're able to force them to become one of your concubines, are a representation of, how do I put this politely? Oh right, I can't put it politely, so I'll put it badly. Rule 34 slavery. So like that can be argued to be an example, and in certain cases you may also encounter passing references to the introduction of slavery in random events, but that is really a glorified flavor text. Now, does CK3 as development need to model slavery? Not really. The economic modeling of Crusader Kings 3 is already, why is the best method of farming money the blackmailing courtiers in the Holy Roman Empire method? Like, we should probably address the blackmail industrial complex first. I think CK3 can genuinely benefit from better representation of the institution, as well as how filthy rich people got from the practice, but honestly, if there is a time period where slavery was taking the backstage, it would be this one. I'm not here to pass judgment whether this is good or not. This is fundamentally up to both your purviews of morality, as well as how much you think the games like CK3 have a duty to educate about history and frankly reality. And now we move on to, oh no, EU4. I don't think slavery in this time period needs much introduction, as so many European countries very much partook in the institution, and the United States of America itself had like 1/3 of their entire national history practically dedicated to slavery. One of the big breakthroughs, and I want to use this word lightly, was when Portugal or Spain, or whoever you want to blame, invented triangles and did the special economic operation all across the Atlantic, otherwise known as the transatlantic slave trade. The innovation here, ironically enough, also very much involved making slaves cheaper. Now, comparing any kind of price for more than 100 years ago is a pointless exercise, and we're talking like 400 to 500 years ago. But if you must, I guess it would at least paint a relative picture. The price of a slave would go from the 100,000, 120,000 range down to the 30,000, 50,000 USD range when converting to modern currency. Or, to frame it another way, Moist Critical's Starfield stream went from buying 3/4 of a person to buying 2 people. Further combining this with the absolute money printer known as slave plantations, and countries and people got very rich very fast. In fact, so much so that to ignore slavery would be fundamentally ignoring how so many of the richest countries in the world at that point got rich, and in a setting like EU4 it would represent an abject failure in even the most basic modelling of reality. And so how does EU4 model slavery? Well, before we talk about that, one last quick little political history lesson from Lemon Cake. You're getting a lot of these, aren't you? We need to talk about the Labour theory of value. I won't waste your time, it's frankly insanely self-explanatory, you don't need to read Marx to get the hint. It's one of the few theories where if you read the title, you're 80% of the way there. But in essence, value is derived from the labour or effort put into the thing that we're evaluating. Now, I did run this through the economist I keep in my basement, and he didn't like my definition, and he gave me a wall of text, which I didn't read, but he also thankfully gave me a TLDR, which I again refused to read. But if it's a TLDR you're interested in, here you go. Anyway, we introduced this concept to say that EU4 is seemingly designed by someone that read this theory, and took such a passionate, principled hatred of the entire concept that the economy works in direct opposition. Namely, labor just doesn't exist. Capital makes more capital with no labor involvement. Sugar plantations harvest themselves. Sheep take themselves to their own sheep workshops, which make the sheep 50% more productive as the sheep start sheeping 50% harder. I can turn up to the Siberian wasteland, which has a population of 12, and build 500 fur trade stations, which automatically man themselves and start trading with very real people that are definitely there and absolutely printing money. And if I want to turn a literal uninhabited island in the middle of nowhere and drop the national resources of Spain for the previous 20 years to develop it to 30, suddenly we have a city of the world's desire up and running on that province when on the previous day it had a literal population of, again, 0. It gets even worse when it comes to modeling population overall, because as I'm sure all EU4 players will be very pleased to know, outside of rulers, advisors, and sometimes generals and admirals, women don't exist. There is a manpower for frontline infantry and sailors pool, and that's it. It is an extreme perversion of the great person view of history, which as a model of history, for those unaware, argues that certain people were great and they did history, and the average person just kind of kicked around in the dirt sometimes. The average person is now devolved into a manpower pool, so congratulations, we've modeled women to not exist, and we've modeled all men to be frontline infantry or ship sailors. In practice, through paradoxically, we've made slaves absolutely useless. They have a trade good value of 2, which goes up to 3 when Portugal, whoever you're blaming, invents triangles, and then become awful when emancipation starts being a thing, having an even further price decreases. This is within the context that most slave provinces, with the couple exceptions like the Azov province north of Crimea, are going to be found in Africa. And Africa is absolutely amazing when it comes to trade good choices. You have gold, you have ivory, you have gems, you have dyes, all excellent trade goods, and instead of getting useful stuff like that, you end up getting slaves. This creates a meta where you want to rush the abolition of slavery as fast as humanly possible so that your provinces can go and produce an actually useful trade good, as slavery as an institution is entirely redundant. Basically, you don't need slaves to work in the plantations because the plantations work themselves. Oh, surely if EU4 failed when it comes to slavery, then we have Victoria 2 and Victoria 3. Oh no, we have to talk about Victoria 3. To be clear, I am in the camp that is not best too pleased with Victoria 3 conceptually. Everything from the combat system to the weirdest economic meta possible, I'm looking at you, fine art-based economies, mean that critiquing Victoria 3 is inherently punching down. With that said, I don't need to elaborate on the history of the time period, but in long and short, slavery was still very much around, and was still making certain individuals filthy rich. But no, this section is going to be quite small because the truth of the situation is much like in EU4, slaves are awful, but significantly more awful than before. The main issue here with slaves is that, within the domain of modern economic simulation, slaves take up jobs, meaning that there are less jobs going around for other pops, while at the same time those slaves don't get paid a wage, meaning they don't have said wage to spend on consumer goods, and basically they don't consume anything, which means you don't get increase in demand for trade goods and your economy doesn't scale. Indeed, this economic weakness of slaves gets downright poetic when you realize that a lot of guides on how to win the American Civil War as the bad guys pretty much all university go, oh, by the way, slavery really fucking sucks, so you need to get rid of it ASAP, preferably in the middle of the Civil War if you know what you're doing, which is frankly a level of irony that writes itself. Can you just imagine Lincoln making the Emancipation Proclamation and then turning around to see that the South abolished slavery last week? Memes aside, indeed there isn't much to add here, apart from the fact that it is the opposite of the EU4 problem. Labour is now needed to run your factories, sure, but ideally you want your workers to have as high wages as possible to help you scale your economy. And here slaves are the absolute worst kind of labourers, as inherently slaves don't get paid and they take away jobs from other people that could be paid. And now a glorified intermission, Hearts of Iron 4. Slavery kind of exists, but only in the sense that the forced labor and penal battalions are mentioned through some focuses. But until EU4 drops the forced labor camp civilian factory, the presence of slavery is relegated to certain focuses, if even that. That's not to say it didn't happen, far from it. Indeed, EU4 takes a CK2 and CK3 approach to focusing on the other aspects of World War II, or the domain of the game, and for the most part pretending really hard that slavery didn't exist. I don't want to repeat myself regarding the CK2 and CK3 sections, but indeed, EU4 sits in arguably the worst position when it comes to representing history. You either ignore, shall we say, the more controversial actions of Germany and Japan, or you model them and risk roleplay enjoyers enjoying the roleplay a little bit too much. Frankly, from a I don't think we should shy away from history, and pretending X didn't happen is worse than ignoring X at all camp, I do think that there should be more representation, for lack of a better word, for the atrocities committed. But at the same time, knowing the average EU4 enjoyer, I understand Paradox's desire to be careful with such developments. But if EU4 is cautious, in the grim dark future of the 15th Stellaris complete rework, after all this is a game that quite literally released with a genocide button, which when pressed caused you to quite literally genocide the population of the local planet. Thankfully, when discussing the history part of slavery in space, we have the creative liberty turned up to 100, because this history hasn't happened yet. So we can discuss it from a tryhard point of view, and by dear god, Stellaris dwarfs basically every other Paradox game to the downright stupid levels of cruelty that you can partake in. Furthermore, as Stellaris gets its weekly rework, it's hard to talk about the balance of slavery as a tactic, because if we talk about the current meta, it'll be out of date within the hour. But to reminisce of the old metas, at the start of Stellaris there were very few percentage modifiers, but one that existed was a very generic pop happiness, which meant that as the pop became happier, it worked harder. Great, but the issue is despite slaves being given like a 10% output to resources, slaves were chronically miserable because they were slaves. So they had awful output because they had like 10% from being slaves and minus 30% from being miserable. Then Paradox innovated on this by making slave happiness not affect their productivity, making slaves at least viable, but following more updates and the introduction of innovations like specific civics and governments that buff slaves, as well as buildings like slave processing facilities that buff slave output, yet turns out slaves became so amazing you'd basically enslave everyone and anyone that you can to maximize your output. Now, slave farmers and miners, fair enough, I can see it. Slave entertainers, I guess that's more doable. You go from a 50% unpaid intern rate in Hollywood to a 100% unpaid intern rate, so a touch harder to imagine, but fair enough. Slave administrators? Okay, it's getting a bit more tough now, but I guess we can run the DMV with slave labor. Fine. Slave researchers? What? And how are the slave researchers more productive than normal scientists? Okay, you know what? Fair enough. And indeed, that got reworked. Much like the rest of Stellaris, slavery as an option would continuously yo-yo between being really strong and good to being awful and unusable. It created some hilarious metas, like the best MP build for a good solid while became a technocratic dictatorship, where you basically enslaved anyone that wasn't a scientist. And since it was a post-utopia update, the scientists in your society would be given massive consumer good buffs and pop maintenance so they could live like kings, while everyone else in society was made a slave to maximize their output and put on literal basic sustenance. Here I have to respect Stellaris in their dedication to not shy away from exposing the player to just how downright evil some of their actions are. When setting economic standards of living, you can choose from things like utopian abundance, as previously mentioned, to social welfare, to decent conditions, and even things like basic sustenance, which is adequately described as, and I quote here, "as few as possible of our subjects should starve. Beyond that, that's not our problem." However, my favourite from a grimdark wow that's harsh has to be the description of the non-existent quality of life, which is, we do not budget for the dead. In essence, Stellaris does not shy away from controversial topics, and that I do respect. Well, there we go. Imperator Rome had slavery, but they didn't finish the mechanic, or frankly the game. Crusader Kings 2 and 3 had slavery historically, but they ignore it really hard inside the actual game. Meanwhile, EU4 and Victoria teach you that slavery is really bad financially, and hence should be abolished in favor of more profitable endeavors such as the ivory trade or selling drugs to China. Hearts of Iron 4 ignores slavery like the very existence of the game depends on it. Meanwhile, Stellaris reworks slavery every other week. I hope you enjoyed this exploration of slavery within the domain of Paradox games and learned something new, but I'm afraid this is all the time I have today. Thank you very much for watching. The special thank you to my channel members, especially Ark, Solar, Solemon, W Haste, Sebastian Haller, Cherdog 2.0, Nick Huss, Dark Fortuna, Big Salad, Leb Josh, Gay Fug, Clockwork Norse, Golden Arrows, Nanhatan, and the Awesome Rabbit.